Hi, my name is David Benjamin. I'm the director of the Meta Layer Initiative. I'm joined today by my colleagues Parham Pourdavood, an independent AI and cognitive researcher, and Dr. Michael Witmore, the former director of the Folger Shakespeare Library and an associate of the Digital Vellum project. We are excited to bring you our paper today, the Teilhard Test, Humanity's Initiation to Technological Adulthood.
Most discussions about AI focus on what machines can do. This presentation begins with a different question. What happens to us as our technologies become increasingly powerful? The Teilhard test asks whether the systems we build help humanity mature from adolescent power into adult responsibility. In that sense, it is not primarily a test of AI. It is a test of humanity's readiness for AI. This is a question of technological adulthood. To understand why we call it a test, it helps to compare it with the most influential thought experiment in the history of AI. In 1950, Alan Turing asked a profound question: can a machine imitate human intelligence? The Turing test evaluates the machine. After 75 years, it is reasonable to ask, where do we stand with respect to Turing's question? AI systems could now generate language, answer questions, and engage in conversation in ways that often appear human. Yet this growing capacity to simulate speech and understanding raises a deeper question. What happens when we can no longer reliably distinguish generated intelligence from human intelligence, and our ability to generate information begins to outpace our ability to sustain shared meaning and a common reality? Whether machines have truly passed the Turing test is debatable, but their capabilities have brought us closer than many imagined possible. The Teilhard test asks a different question. Can humanity grow into the intelligence it has created? This test evaluates us. Now, that may sound like a philosophical inversion, but it has practical consequences. Tests become targets. Tests become design targets. If our benchmark is imitation, we build better imitators. If our benchmark is human maturation, we build systems that strengthen human agency, responsibility, and collective intelligence. The test we center changes what civilization optimizes for. If humanity is being tested, then what condition are we actually in today? We define reality collapse as a systemic failure. Facts exist, but they lose their ability to coordinate collective understanding and action. More than ever, we struggle to distinguish between human and synthetic participation in our shared information environments. Reality collapse emerges when information abundance no longer produces shared meaning. It is that truth can no longer perform its social function. It's not that reality collapse is truth disappearing. Think about climate, public health, elections, or AI governance. In many cases, we are not suffering from too little information. We are suffering from too little shared meaning. The facts are still there. They just can no longer hold us together. So how did we get here? The argument of this paper is that our technological power has evolved faster than our capacity to govern it. across every major technological wave, personal computers, the internet, social media, AI systems, and now AI agents, we see the same pattern. Each dramatically expands what we can do, but the mechanisms for accountability, feedback, and governance do not expand at the same rate. The gap grows ever larger. This paper draws on developmental psychology to describe this as a form of technological adolescence. Adolescence is not a lack of power. It is a gap between power and integration, capability growing faster than wisdom, influence growing faster than accountability. The result is what some researchers describe as an immature technosphere, a civilization capable of reshaping the planet, but not yet fully capable of governing the consequences. The argument so far is straightforward. First, we shift the question from machine intelligence to human maturity. Second, we identify a condition of reality collapse where shared sense making weakens. Third, we observe a widening gap between technological power and responsibility. The next question becomes, how do we evaluate technologies according to whether they increase humanity's capacity for reflection, coordination, and responsibility at planetary scale? This is the purpose of the Teilhard Test.
Yeah, so to follow up on what David beautifully just mentioned, I'll iterate that the value of a test is what we make of it and how we interpret it, and it motivates us to go and build designs and systems and actually make decisions in the world based on our measurement system. And so if we focus on the Turing test, which has been the obsession of technology has motivated us to create the technologies and interfaces. The way we do is we focus on imitation, like imitating us and what that does and how well we can imitate. But what that loses, and this was Teilhard's insight that he mentions in The Future of Man, for example, is that what kind of process is technological advancement, and more importantly, what that does to humans, what sort of functions it opens up, kind of new responsibilities and skill sets it opens up. And so that kind of directs us to think about a new test and how that new test lets us make decisions that are beneficial to humanity. And so and Teilhard was very influenced by evolutionary biology. So the insight that we draw from that, and this has been talked about in the literature, is that whenever there is a new layer, whenever there's a new technological advancement, and this could be in biology too, whenever there is a new evolutionary transition, there is a period of instability. So it takes time for the new layer to create healthy and generative feedback loops with the layers that come before it. And the argument is that we're going through that now. And my colleague Boris Philly and their other work like Frank et al., they talk about actually biosphere and geosphere and how, for example, the biosphere went through an immature period and it had the cycles of life, and the geosphere had to go through this equilibrium with each other. So we ask, if we are humanities, the layer that created a layer above it, which is the technological layer, what sort of functions do we need to make sure get lost? And how can we make sure humans flourish and become part of this cycle so we don't lose our values and intention and the institutions that we've created when it comes to influence, accountability, transparency, power. So these are all important aspects that we can't lose sight of. and just focus on the technology. We need to make sure that all these institutions and functions remain cohesive and generative. Yeah, so Teilhard Test, and we iterated again here. And we kind of hone in on 4 aspects of the humanity layer, what kind of test we can have, 4 important criteria that we think, if those are checked, we're in a pretty good shape when it comes to this test. So we focus on reflection. So the reflection, what we mean by is mostly like transparency, how clearly the technology reflects us and the actions behind the scene that are being taken. Coordination, how well we're communicating and coordinating, the responsibility as there's a new when there's a new technology, or there may be some players who have access to a lot of power because new technology is powerful. So how can we make sure we put checks and balances on this new responsibility that might drop at a hand of like a few individuals and organizations? And also, how can we make sure we don't lose sight of diverse individual diversity? So I think that's very important because when there is a new technology, especially with AI, it's the most relevant now. It's very easy to forget about all the data that went through it, all the individual contributions that went in our history, in the history of our species, and right now. So how can we make sure those individual voices percolate to these systems and don't get lost as we become more powerful? So again, I go through the 4 criteria that we've laid out. So reflexivity. So if it automates and imitates while it hides and it doesn't remain interpretable, that's an issue. That would be a failure of the test. And if we make decisions without kind of accounting for the people and aligning with people who are the constituents, that would rank low for this test. Again, as if there's no differentiation of beliefs and voices in that technological layer, if people are flattened, uh, that would s- uh, that would be a low score for this test. And again, the responsibility, if there's too much power and and we cannot account for the power and put checks on them and control it, and that would be an issue if there is a new technological layer. So it's a question of concentration of power. How well concentrated is the new layer makes up as a society. So here we go through some examples. So one thing that I would mention here, I'm pretty self-explanatory, but it's that we would think that as technology becomes more advanced, then more of these issues get solved because we're getting more sophisticated. So it turns out it actually is not the case. We've gone the opposite, where as we've gone through like personal computers, the internet, social media, now with AI agents, we've lost transparency, we've lost convergence without diluting individuals. It's become less differentiated. AI is just like an average of our voices and power. We can be too complex ruling space right now. So low, weak, threatened, high risk. So what's the solution here? And what we propose is that for that feedback loop that we talked about that needs to be there between human and this layer, that feedback loop needs some mechanism, needs some sort of institution and logic to it to solve these issues. And that's where produce the meta layer.
Thank you. From the prior points, I think it becomes clear that there's not only a problem that can't be addressed by the Turing test, namely some of the dynamics that have been named that feel like they frustrate the evolution of humans into a collective and informed and cooperative set of communities. The meta layer would be a layer that exists on top of existing information systems that rewards some of the dynamics and the positive virtues that have been described and which would be recognizable within the Teilhard test. So you can think of different layers from the most concrete to the more abstract. Some of those already exist on the internet. We have information, we have documents, we have communities. With social media, we add algorithmic distribution. And then with AI agents, we finally move through agency that takes us through different areas of the information that exists. There is already a tradition of trying to understand how to deal with records and memory and use it in the service of collective action and wisdom. In the West, that has been called the humanities, and it's often been focused on documents and memory. I bring my own perspective as a former research library and archive director to this project, wanting to understand how these various layers and how the absence of a meta layer makes it much more difficult for us to continue to reward the kinds of transparency and reflexivity that allow for truth seeking and common ground seeking among interested collectives of people. So if you move from the layers in this slide up to the meta layer, I think you see these four virtues: visibility, context, consent, and governance. If we move to the next slide, the Teilhard test, when applied to any information technology or formation within the technosphere, asks us to make specific judgments about certain criteria. So, is reflexivity limited? Is the form of interaction that we're being offered allowing us to see sources of information, to see interests? Is there a convergence risk? Are we synthesizing answers that really aim at one outcome? To what degree can communities or individuals differentiate within that technosphere? Uh, the philosopher Spinoza, often who understood all of reality as one thing and one substance, nevertheless emphasized the need to preserve smaller unities in that collective. And I think that's a philosophy that has animated a lot of theorists who've been interested in collective deliberation, public discourse. There have been many different flavors of that. But I think the Teilhard test gets us out of the frame of thinking in terms of truth or imitation. We're not talking about a postmodern world in which the truth has disappeared. We're talking about a world in which individuals and groups can reliably point themselves at facts or opinions and come to consensus, even through disagreement, about what is important to them. And I think that leads to the fourth power and responsibility piece, which is really about how access to information is concentrated and how authority is distributed through a conversation. In the next slide, we think about civic memory. That's a test case for why something like a meta layer would be important. I'll just give you an example. The Chilean mine collapse of 2010, where 33 miners were trapped deep underground. It was an event that was watched all over the world. It was complex. It involved consultations with NASA, who helped figure out how to drill down and actually access these miners and bring them out of the mine. It tested technology, but it also raised questions about liability, who was responsible for these miners, what their compensation was. And as a large media event that was also something that really happened, it's a great example of a civic memory where the society wants to go through what happened and understand who the actors were, what the incentives were, what the evidence is, who was at fault. So we could imagine a system where we have layers of information that can be coordinated, and civic memory becomes the dialogue between actors who can reliably attest to their own experience. These 33 miners actually, instead of giving their own testimony, they all spoke to a single writer a writer named Hector Tobar, who interviewed all of them and told the story of this mine collapse, and in a way figured out how to get a collective voice out of the individual experiences of these miners. That is a kind of process that could actually be mediated in the meta layer. You want to be able to have access to a plurality of voices and evidence so that you can understand what really happened. And you want to create dialogue and consensus around what did happen so that it can become an object of civic memory. It can either be a warning against future catastrophes, but it can also be a memory of heroic actions. And clearly, all 33 miners survived, but the heroic efforts and technology to get them out was really a national and an international story. We will need some kind of layer that responds to the virtues that Teilhard Test was praising and was aiming at. And that's why this framing is so important. If you could go to the next slide. Well, we just want to end by saying that while it is true that our access to memory, to information, and to each other is going to be increasingly mediated by AI and AI agents, that does not erase the need for a deliberate and designed environment in which we can interact with memory materials, where authority can be evaluated and distributed, and where we can have the ongoing dialogue about memory, about aspirations, about hope, and about our evolution as a planetary species on a fragile planet. We believe that the Teilhard test is an appropriate reframing and is it itself a logical next step after the Turing test. And we hope that in addition to identifying the need for something like the meta layer, we've argued for the reasons why such a layer would be an answer to the Teilhard test. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the three speakers, David, Parham, and also Michael, for your wonderful sharing. Let's see if we have any questions from the audience. If not, I have a very short one. So the Teilhard test seems to assume that humanity as a whole should grow up, but in different cultures, they may define mature in different ways. So how do we get a consensus on this concept of adulthood or mature?
Is the question about how adulthood could be understood in different cultures? I didn't
Yeah.
quite hear everything. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. And one thing that makes the Teilhard test attractive is that maturity can be understood culturally. Clearly, there are very different accounts of what makes up wisdom, prudence, maturity, but it is keyed in the end to the evolution of a species and the maturity of an individual. So I think that there's a tension between what are clearly different cultural interpretations of maturity and frankly of wisdom. But I think human development does tend toward wisdom, and it depends on the transmission of wisdom over very long periods of time. And one interesting development from the Teilhard test would be to hear multiple accounts and different national and cultural traditions that give shape and texture to this idea of what maturity might be. That would be actually a much more productive debate, I think, to have rather than debates about competition and powers of AI models or other framings of the problem. And I'm sure my other two co-panelists will have opinions about this.
I would just briefly say that I think it would be very interesting to do some research and coordination between China and the US being the two most advanced AI powers. And if we could look at something like the Teilhard test and see if there's a way of alignment around just our two countries, we're really making some big steps forward.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Professor Chen has a question.
Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. I have one question. It seems that your aim is to create a safety AI for the.
Can you please speak up a little louder?
Hello.
对，肯定要跑到这儿来。
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you for your
Um,
presentations. It seems that your aim is to create a safety AI to create to establish some criteria to about the safe AI. Why do you use the term? I think it's no relation with it. Please explain it. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. I think you should say who Teilhard Test was, since that's relevant. And we didn't say a lot about it.
Parham, you want to?
Yeah, sure. So why the Teilhard test? So we have another test. And that's like the imitation test. So with the imitation test, obsession and focus is on the technology itself. So how well it's imitating us and what that's affording us. I think Teilhard's insight was that he always talked about technology relative to humanity, what it's doing to humanity. So and he had an evolutionary perspective on this, and in evolution, to major evolutionary transitions, whenever there is a new medium or activity that's new, there needs to be a stability period where the loops between the new advancement and the previous layers that gave rise to that medium, making sure the loops are healthy and generative. So Teilhard, not surprising that he had an evolutionary perspective on this, asked, what is technology doing to us? And his answer was, as technology is taking care of more of our tasks, as it's imitating us better, we get to partake in new skills and activities. And the role of the technology is to uplift our human creativity and collective decision making. So it's in a way changing the focus from imitation, which is in Turing test, to a focus on humanity and what technology is doing to humanity.
Yeah, and I would just like to add in there that Teilhard was very interested in convergent consciousness, and he thought of it, or I'll say that I'm paraphrasing. My understanding of what he was saying is that we need to be able to coordinate without collapsing diversity. And we decided that that was actually a really good goal for humanity. If humanity could coordinate better without forcing everyone to be the same, then it's a very positive outlook potentially. And because he was focused on that, we thought of the test as a way to determine if our technology is actually moving us in that direction towards that convergent consciousness.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. That was